Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we got a great episode here in store for us. I'm joined with Bob Hutton, who is a professor of history and Appalachian Studies at Glenville University. Mr. Hutton, how you doing?
Good. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm in Kentucky. So before we get started on anything else, tell us about your Kentucky connection, or just a little bit about your background and so forth.
Well, long before I got here to Glenville State, which has only been less than 3 years ago, I did my first ever graduate level research in Kentucky. And I believe my first research trip was in 2000.
Oh,
So it's been
okay.
nearly
Yeah.
25 years ago.
Wow.
And that was I did a master's thesis on a so-called feud situation in Garrett County. Have you ever done an episode about Garrett County?
We have a little bit of Garrett County history out there. Yep.
All right. And then of course my the book we're talking about today was my PhD dissertation at Vanderbilt.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I've and of course I have a lot of friends who live around in the bluegrass and in eastern Kentucky. I don't know too many people in western Kentucky these days.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I guess the cherry on top is I used to grade AP U.S. history exams in Louisville every summer.
Oh, that sounds
They've
like
since
fun.
moved the grading location, but I wish they would move it back to Louisville.
Oh, well, sounds good. You definitely got this depth of knowledge in history, and we're going to talk about, like you brought up there, Bloody Breathitt, the politics and violence in the Appalachian South. Kentucky is a bit known for some feuds, and like you even brought up the Garrett County feud. As I've started this channel and been going through the county histories, you can just about find a feud in every county. Some sort of big political thing come up, and somebody, always somebody ends up shooting somebody, and it oftentimes takes place in between, after the Civil War, about 1920-ish. Somebody gets in a feud, and this big drama starts, and it kind of becomes folklore as well. In certain cases, sometimes it kind of dies down and so forth. But Breathitt County, I'll preference this. The Bloody Breathitt. This comes up a lot. Dark and bloody ground in Kentucky history when it first starts. You got Bloody Harlan. You got the Hatfields and McCoys. Kentucky has gotten a reputation of a little bit of violence over history. Do you find that true?
I do. I mean, Kentucky has its share of violence and abuse, just like so many other places in the United States. A friend of mine who did this is going to take us a little bit far out of ground, but
that's okay.
Just to give it some perspective. A friend of mine was researching Cherokee removal out of what became the state of Georgia, and he found documents where people who were defending Cherokee removal against detractors from up in New England, they would basically say, well, you live in the allegedly, perfectly settled, peaceful state of New Hampshire. What were you doing to the Penobscot Indians 200 years ago? It's a very similar thing. Which is where I'm going with this is practically every state of the union has some history of horror and violence It's just
Yeah.
that some of them, the reputation sticks more than others, and for one reason or another, Kentucky's has definitely stuck. Now, I'll preface that by saying also, um, Kentucky has a particular reputation for white on white violence, which I
Mhm.
think is a major component of what the so-called feuds often were. Violence against African Americans is far more pointed in a place like Mississippi or Texas, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Or violence against Native Americans. I mean, the name where that hasn't happened, it's happened
Mhm.
everywhere. But the American Southwest is probably better known for that, or
Yeah.
South Dakota. But in West Virginia's case, even before the Civil War, there was the association between politics and violence had already sort of been stuck, and a lot of that came from the history of dueling that was present in Kentucky, just like it was many other
Mhm.
places.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 Well, that's very true. It comes with the over time, and it is interesting how it sticks some places as it doesn't in others. But what brought you to this book? You mentioned the Garrett feud, but what made you sit down? And I assume this book took you many months, years to write, or I mean I don't
Oh,
know. Maybe
years.
you're a speed writer and you busted it out quick. um,
No, 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 no.
but what brought you to this specific topic or this duel or not duel feud? And let's just get into it, I guess.
Yeah, good question. I'd already gotten, and when I was working on my master's down in North Carolina at Appalachian State, I was already sort of interested in the topic of violence in history, and I'd found out about Garrett County as an antebellum feud between relatively elite slave owners, sort of on the outskirts, what one might call the plantation South, but still.
Yeah.
And then I looked into other people's research and found that, particularly the work of Professor Altana Waller, who's written about the Hatfields McCoy situation. Um, I going off of research that she and a few other people have done, I noticed that, like you say, so many counties in Kentucky, almost all 120 of them, have some sort of association with the word feud, whether the word was applied to one knife fight or whether it was applied to a riot that involved dozens of people, like in Rowan County. One
Mhm.
way or the other, though, it's a very widespread label for violence in the state. I just happened to notice that Breathitt County had multiple incidents with the word applied to it. Like you said, something like the Civil War to 1920. Well, yeah, basically within that time period, you have some sort of media attention using the F word, uh, going from the Reconstruction era all the way up to the Progressive era.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, well, there must be something to that. There must be something going on there that people are going to find interesting. And so I started delving into that, uh, basically starting with the Reconstruction era and then later working backward, then later working forward. And yeah, it took a good many years. If you included the dissertation stage all the way up to the book, we're talking nearly 8 years.
Phew, whoosh. Well, and I mean,
And
that's
that
what.
includes the index. If you, I mean, I'm throwing in the entire process when I say nearly 8 years, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's a long time.
Yeah, yeah, which you have some other books, so we can mention those as well. Um, so what sets it different than, say the Hatfields and McCoy? Is it just publicity? Is that what's happened? I mean,
No,
yeah.
it was considerably more violent than what went on in the Tug River Valley.
Mhm.
You've done a prior show on the Hatfields McCoys, right?
Actually, we haven't yet. I mean,
Oh, okay. Well, it was
well, I mean, who doesn't know about it? But, no,
well.
we've not actually focused on it yet.
A lot of people know the phrase Hatfields McCoys is kind of an American idiom.
Mhm,
When
mhm,
when Waylon Jennings said we've been fighting like the Hatfields McCoys in the lyrics to Lukenbach, Texas, that idiom has nothing historically to do with Lukenbach, Texas, but he assumes the listener is going to understand the analogy.
yeah,
But people who have some basic inkling of it think of it as some sort of long-standing ancient hatred that went back decades or centuries, when in fact it was a what, 7 homicides over the course of 12 years, or
Mhm. Yeah.
something to that effect. And with Breathitt County, though, which is not so far away from the Tug River Valley, we're talking an indeterminate number of homicides, but a whole series of incidents that involved, the state militia having to show up and keep peace, or a county judge being tried for murder, any number of situations stretching from the Civil War era all the way up to the roughly about 1910. And each of these incidents kind of had their own historical context that reflected how things had changed in the county.
Mhm.
So what I argue about Breathitt County is, there does seem to be something inherent to, a certain element of chaos that seems to stretch out for nearly 50 years, that's inherent, but yet
Mhm.
the forms of violence and the situation of violence changes depending on what's going on historically in Kentucky and in the United States at the time.
Wow. Wow. And just to kind of, well, before I move on, you talk about like, a lot with the Hatfield McCoys, it's kind of more popularized, dramatized, and you think, "Oh, man, all this is," they were just hanging out the window shooting at each other all the time, and that was not really the case. But that's, just the dramatizing it, I can't get it out. But over time, that's kind of, how it went and so forth. Breathitt County, north of Perry County, kind of right in the, I want to say, like, middle of Eastern Kentucky, and if you cut it in half, right down 75. Breathitt County's, by Clay County, that kind of area. Jackson is the county seat and so forth.
It's
Just
what they in the old days they called it the Three Forks region because it's where the Three Forks of the Kentucky flow
that's right.
through, and I think they come together somewhere maybe in Wolfe County.
Hmm.
Not sure about that, but
Yeah.
they used to call it the Three Forks region.
Hmm. And another, my wife is from Hazard in Perry County, so I've been through Jackson and Breathitt a few times. Went to a football game there. But what got this feud started? Where did it even begin at?
You can't really talk about violence in the United States after 1865 without talking about the Civil War.
Exactly.
Uh, Breathitt County was the locus of a tremendous amount of guerrilla activity,
Hmm.
as well as I don't want to use the word legitimate necessarily, but the standard military units from both the Union and the Confederacy, with the standard banners, shall we say, did have activities there. But after 1863, you see a war going on, a division based on the Civil War going on internally within the county. Um, the leadership, the local political leadership, seemed to be mostly pro-Confederacy.
Hmm.
In fact, it's a lot of the people who had petitioned to form the county back in the 1830s who seemed to be leading that effort. And it seemed to be kind of the older population who had been there back when it was still portions of Perry County and Clay County. I think there was a third county it was also formed out of. They seem to be the ones who are more likely to be Unionist. So it's not entirely, there's not an overwhelming Confederate majority like what you had up in Floyd County. It's
Hmm.
not an overwhelmingly Union majority like what you would have in Owsley or Jackson County.
Hmm.
It's actually pretty almost evenly divided, and
Yeah.
that turns into a very nasty situation. I did find out that they after the war, they for a couple years they make a pretty brave effort of maintaining the peace, trying to establish some sort of reunion, and then of course that gets complicated by the politics of Reconstruction,
Hmm.
which not only puts the former Confederates and Unionists against each other again, it also creates divisions among the Unionists, some of whom are not so happy with the results of the war that they fought for, namely black citizenship.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, really, what's going on in Breathitt County in, say, about 1867 when they have an election there, 1868, they have the presidential election, is there's versions of it going on all over Kentucky
Yeah.
because the entire state, as you know, was heavily divided during the war.
Yeah.
But unlike the rest of the South, it's not subject to any sort of reconstruction or um, federal military occupation
Hmm.
or any attempts to try to keep the peace like what you see in Louisiana or South Carolina, for instance.
Yeah.
So there's reflection of the sort of guerrilla activity that's going on so many other places all over the South. And
Hmm.
then after the war, you see a reflection of Reconstruction violence that's also going on so many other places all over the South.
Hmm. It's a common theme whenever you look around Kentucky. Some counties heavy Union, some counties heavy Confederate, some counties completely split, and then some counties completely split, but only one person voted for Lincoln, or it gets it's kind of wild. You kind of the typical story people hear is Eastern Kentucky, heavy Democrat, Western Kentucky, heavy Confederate, but in all reality, it wasn't really that much at all. Like, you had the pockets where it was 50-50, like you said, and it's interesting. A lot of who would imagine that conflict would arise from all that?
Well, initially the states, they have this pro-union legislature and a pro-Confederate governor,
Mhm.
Rob McGoffin. He decides to resign,
Yeah,
and they initiate this period of just sort of wait and see, the neutrality period.
yeah,
And during that neutrality period, the waiting for Zollicoffer to finally invade from the south, the Confederacy just couldn't help themselves apparently.
yeah.
During that period of neutrality, a lot of people make up their own mind,
Mhm,
and the vast majority statewide are pro-union. Don't
mhm.
get the wrong idea, but of all the states that didn't secede, Kentucky produced the most Confederate recruits.
Yeah.
If that makes any sort of sense,
Mhm, mhm.
both I think in sheer numbers as well as percentage of the population. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, yeah, very much. Um, now within Breathitt County, as you said, 50-50. So what sparked the feud? Who we looking at as far as families go?
Well,
Or
the first time you really see the word feud used as far as I can tell, not until 1874. And at
Mhm,
that point, there's another election. In fact, 1874 was an unusually heated election all over the South.
mhm,
It's when the Democrats retook Congress, pretty much the beginning of the end for Reconstruction.
mhm.
Um, there was I'm trying to remember the exact circumstances. The first time you ever hear the phrase "bloody breath" it was in 1874. First
Uh-huh.
time you see it in print,
Mhm,
and the general idea was you see basically a fight over the courthouse, just like you do in Garrett County that same year. Um, Pretty much the division is the leaders of both sides are former Unionists versus former Confederates, and it's not familial at all. It's
mhm.
factional,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it's a lot of veterans from both sides staring each other down, taking a few pot shots. I don't recall that there were any recorded fatalities in 1874, but it was
Mhm.
enough to get the Kentucky militia called out and to occupy the place for a while. And the last newspaper article I was able to find out about it was a baseball game.
Was it well, I say this, jokingly, but was it a church softball baseball game?
Do what?
I say this jokingly, but was it a church softball baseball game?
I mean, it was a regimental. I mean, it was the members of the militia who were playing ball, and but they were
Oh.
playing by 19th century rules, so it would have been underhanded pitch. So in that respect, yeah, not the traditional softball.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there was a song put out, I can't remember it, church, softball fist fight or something like that.
Uh,
I can't remember, but, those games can get heated. They can.
they can,
Uh,
yeah.
so as you said, you kind of focus on how the violence changes as the history of America or Kentucky changes. What's some of the biggest differences, I guess, as that goes through the time or the decades even?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, okay, so in 1874 and 1878, when it really takes on this reputation, and by the way, the word feud is just beginning to become popularized during that time.
Mhm.
Um, in those 2 years, there you see very similar things happening elsewhere in the country, or
Mhm.
elsewhere in the South, shall we say?
Yeah.
But as labor violence heats up in parts of the North and the Midwest, elements of that start showing up too. So situations where troops are having to be called out in order to put down a riot, some sort of factional uh, conflict going on over an election.
Mhm.
Okay, bing, bang, boom. That's something that's very common in the 1870s, right?
Yeah.
Number two, the only um, lynching that I'm aware of in the history of Breathitt County was actually a double lynching. It was a unionist veteran and an African American teenager who was helping him were lynched in front of the courthouse in 1884. Well, you
Wow.
know what? According to the research of George Wright, 1884 was a particularly high numbered year in Kentucky for lynchings. I mean, later on, it's in the 1890s when it becomes nationally uh,
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
an
Big thing.
epidemic throughout the South, further south. But in Kentucky, it was huge. It was a huge number of people were killed by lynch mobs
Yeah.
in the 1880s. Um, there was when the railroad finally gets there in 1891. It's preceded by a labor strike. Now that wasn't particularly deadly violence, but when Jackson becomes a boom town, mainly
Mhm.
based around lumber, not so much coal. There's the sort of violence that we associate with industrial um, company towns. Even though
Yeah.
Jackson was never an actual company town, around 1891, it starts to look a lot like one, right? Um, one of the most, maybe the most famous incident of violence in Breathitt County's history was actually you might call it a legal form of violence, and that was the state mandated hanging of a guy named Bad Tom Smith. It was in 1895. I'm not saying that more people were hanged in 1895 than any other particular year, but public hangings with thousands of people watching, very common thing in the 1890s. So that's reflecting larger,
Mhm.
larger trends. And then finally, the murders that take place between 1902 and 1903, carried out by the Hargis courthouse, old Judge Hargis, Big Jim Hargis, and
Mhm.
his henchmen in the sheriff's department. Um, these are a new form of very modern public assassination style killings.
Mhm.
They're somewhat reflective, I argue, of the assassination of Governor William Goebel in Frankfurt
Mhm. Yep.
in
Yep.
January of, like, almost exactly this
1900.
month, 100
Yeah.
125 years ago this winter. And they're also somewhat reflective of the rash of anarchist associated assassinations going on in Europe, and of course the death of William McKinley.
Mhm.
And these shootings that take place at the behest of the Hargis courthouse in 1902 and 1903 sort of follow that same style of violence. Eliminate your challenger, make sure that everyone knows you're doing it without presenting any proof of it. Um, so in that sense, each type of violence was very current with what was going on elsewhere at the time.
Mhm.
It wasn't just the same situation over and over again. I mean, it did make it seem like Breathitt County people were going to get murdered in large numbers every 10 years. But when it did happen, it was always something new. It was always some new form of violence.
Mm. Was it, a few things. Was it like, oftentimes, vigilante justice or, I mean, could you categorize it in that, or is it just straight up some sort of conflict?
Well, that reminds me of why I have a problem with the word feud. And the word feud suggests that there's some sort of reciprocity between equal parties, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
The Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet, it's established right up at the front. These are two, I can't remember the exact wording from Shakespeare, but these are two families that are completely equal in standing and they hate each other. No one knows why. Well, most of the violence in the history of Breathitt County was typically the more powerful using violence to maintain their power against challengers. It was very rarely, and there's sometimes challengers like Captain Bill, who's on the cover of my book. He was the challenger to the post-Confederate Democratic regime that maintains control over the county for so much longer than that. And he was not afraid to use violence. And eventually he was killed himself in 1897, in very mysterious circumstances. But in the meantime, though, 9 times out of 10, most of the time in between about the Civil War itself up to the Hargis killings, it was generally someone relatively powerful maintaining their power through killing off anyone who challenged them. And that's not a feud.
No.
That's political violence, if you will.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we could read about it in the news coming from almost so many countries all over the world, shall we say,
Yeah. Yeah.
in our own time. Violence is more often the tool of the powerful, not the powerless.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I was hoping, with that theme, that a lot of people would appreciate what I was discovering, who weren't themselves all that interested in Kentucky or Appalachia to begin with.
Hmm.
But a lot of what I found out showed that the history of Breathitt County reflects a lot of other places in the world. Not perfectly. It's not like a blueprint or something, but
Yeah.
there are certain echoes throughout history where you can kind of say, this sort of reminds me of, this particular part of Spain in the 1930s,
Uh-huh.
or this particular part of South America in the 1980s, or what have you. Um, there are certain, shall we say, eternal recurrences that you could trace if you were a political scientist or an anthropologist.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is interesting because during that time period, you bring up Goebbels' assassination, and he, you know, he's shot in front of the Capitol. But people don't even know. Even there's even more to that story. Goebel actually shot somebody right on the street, and a lot of these people, they claim defense or self defense, and then who's to challenge them if the other person's dead? How can they do that? But there's a lot of that, especially around the 1900s. Right around the turn of the century there,
Hmm.
that happens. And you know, I kind of feel too that that is definitely an area. And you throw in the Breathitt incidents in Breathitt as well. Um, Kentucky gets this name of don't go into these areas of Kentucky. They can be rough. Um, but it's interesting just how much that sticks, and well, I mean, honestly, how much of it's going on. I mean, you can find out. I brought up the vigilante justice because I've read many different little books about where somebody dies, and there's really no trial or anything, but like a rumor comes around that it's this person, so they go and seek out those people, and before you know it, they get put in prison. The state's called in to protect this person because they're afraid the mob's outside, and then the mob shows up and they get the person out of the jail and go and hang them without a trial or anything. Um, very much of the time, as you said, which makes it just even more interesting. Is there any big cases or any ones that just stick out the most to you out of all the Breathitt um, incidences, violence that that shocks you? I mean, the political one is pretty shocking as well because that brings up a very good point that it's not really it's more of a social economic uh, violence, if you want to say it that way. But any
You know,
others that go ahead?
it was basically political throughout. I mean,
Hmm.
in Kentucky, the two-party system after the Civil War was based on people voting like they had shot, or at least voting like dad had shot or like granddad had shot,
Hmm.
for pretty much right up until the, shall we say, the 1930s. I think
Yeah.
there's certain changes in the both parties up at that point. And that's reflected in the electoral maps that you see of Kentucky
Mhm.
for a very long time, frankly, right up to the present. I think the
Yeah.
most recent gubernatorial election still shows the old Whig Gibraltar that dates back, places, the surrounding areas of Pulaski County
Mhm.
that where Henry Clay was most popular, still maintaining, the core of Republican support. And then
Mhm.
have these the Democratic map doesn't look like it used to. You still see what I call the Jacksonian archipelago: Floyd
Mhm.
County, Morgan County, Breathitt County, a handful of Democratic counties out
Mhm.
there, kind of in the Three Forks region.
Mhm.
Um, to answer your actual question, but yeah, I thought the entire process was based on politics,
Mhm.
both in the sense of Republicans and Democrats, that is, former Unionists and former Confederates, but also politics in the most simple and the most purest sense of the word. The allocations and reallocations of power,
Mhm.
just like I said, you could see globally in so many other cases. What you asked me, what probably shocked me and surprised me the most, and it comes back to the reason that Captain Bill Strong ends up on the cover of the book.
Mhm.
The fact that he was so dissatisfied with being on the winning side of the war, but being on the losing side locally, and then
Uh-huh.
forming this coalition of former white Unionists, as well as the very small, numerically African American population in Breathitt County, and sort of, I never was able to find proof of this, but he allegedly had kind of a fort built in the southern part of Breathitt County, where they would sort of gather and have basically their own government beneath the Jackson government.
Yeah.
Um, he kept up this campaign. You might want to call it a campaign of dissatisfaction. Occasionally, picking off his enemies here and there for decades, long
Wow.
after the war was over.
Mhm.
And when you started to see the reemergence of what they roughly, very loosely called a Ku Klux
Mhm.
organization in the 1890s, he steps up and says, "I'm going to fight this," and that's
Mhm.
probably apparently what got him killed in 1897.
Mhm.
But the fact that you would have this, basically a warlord, for lack of a better term, established by membership in the Union Army, and um, his ability to form kind of a political regime around just his own personal leadership, as kind
Mhm.
of, the man on the white horse, for people who found themselves on the outs within the
Yeah.
county over the next few decades. And once he's killed, the challenges to the Democratic post-Confederate regime are almost useless.
Mhm. Mhm.
In
Yeah.
fact, it's actually a dissident republic. It's no, yeah, it's his nephew, who's among the people who's murdered
Mhm.
about 6 years later by the Hargis regime. And so there's a certain continuity, but uh, it seems very strange to me that he would have kept it up quite as long as he did. A lot of people who supported him just left.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Kentucky has a tremendous amount of out migration during this time.
Mhm. Mhm.
Even in the 1890s, just to show how modern things are, they even have a situation where the sheriff embezzles some money and runs off to Arkansas. Can't get much more modern than that, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not, blood feud violence. That's a new kind of, monetary based crime. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's a problem. It's a problem place for a lot of reasons, but it really, you cannot dismiss the centrality of the Civil War
Mhm.
when it comes down to it. I was really blessed and encouraged by the fact that so many people considered my book to be a Civil War history. even though the vast majority of the chapters don't. They take place after the war.
Yeah, yeah.
But that made me feel very good because I have a lot of friends who are Civil War historians, and I really appreciated their respect, and I even got honorable mention for one book award that was
Hey,
specific for
hey,
histories
that's awesome.
of the Civil War, so that's not bad,
Yeah,
considering it's hardly a Civil War history.
yeah. Well, and well, it just goes to show you, as history goes, like how big that event was, because like the ramifications of the Civil War, affected Kentucky for 40, 50 years afterwards. And you could argue it, up until to present day, you could say it's affected it as well. I always kind of think about how you know um, Kentucky, and we can get into the what the effects Kentucky, what went on in Kentucky during the Civil War, but the fact that all these politicians came up and pretty much were like, this Kentucky is part of the South kind of thing. This motto of we're the South, even though they didn't join the South and so forth. But that animosity or that hatred for how things were done during the Civil War, that they then uh, just link themselves to the South, and you think, why would you link yourself to the losing side in that sense? And um, which I mean that's it's the way it went. There's nothing we can do about it. But
It
I
would
don't
have
know.
been
Oh,
a
sorry.
very quite the challenge. I mean, if you were in, I lived in East Tennessee for quite some time, and
Hmm.
and that's an area very well known for people deep within the Confederacy who were anti-Confederate, right?
Yeah.
And if you went the way of Tennessee seceding, you could say, well, I'm doing it out of loyalty to Tennessee. And
Hmm.
people over in Greenville could say, well, I'm against secession, and I'm saying that out of loyalty to the United States.
Yeah.
But if you're pro-Confederate in Kentucky, your algebra of political loyalty is going to have to be a lot more complicated
Hmm.
because you're not really laying you're not really laying any sort of you're not basing your politics on loyalty to the ground you happen to be standing on. I'll put it
Hmm.
that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Something else, and you're taking a huge chance,
Yeah. Yeah.
just like Unionists further than in the Deep South did themselves. But
Hmm.
it's a political mathematics that's really hard to determine. But for one reason or another, one of the hardest things I had to try to figure out, and I don't think I ever completely figured it out, was what motivated XYZ persons and the side they chose.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a very difficult thing to figure out. You couldn't base it completely on slavery, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well,
Not
and
anyway.
yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people try to do is basic strictly on an issue. And if you think back, during that time, like you just said, somebody might say, "I'm going to go join the Confederacy because Tennessee joined the Confederacy." Somebody might say, "I'm going to go join the Union because Kentucky is neutral," or whatever. It could very well be that reason. And the same thing, somebody might say, "I'm going to go join the Confederacy because I'm pro-slavery," and vice versa. A lot of people want to say it was one thing, but it could have been multiple things. You really don't know what was in these people's heads, what and why they might have joined, unless they wrote it down in a diary or something. And those exist, but you don't want to generalize, I
I
guess.
mean, talk to my buddy Patrick Lewis, who works out at the Filson, and he did his research on the anti-secession slave owners of Kentucky. And there are quite a few of them.
Yeah.
And you know what their motivation was? They said, you know what? If you attempt this scheme of secession, it's going to be the end of slavery, y'all.
Hmm.
And you know what? They were right. And
Yep.
then Patrick found a lot of them in Kentucky.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, gee, we might need to get him on and talk about those
Yeah, we
people.
should. Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah, I missed saying there's the quote that's been attributed to multiple different people from Thomas Clark to C. Van Woodward is that Kentucky waited to secede in 1865 rather than 1861.
Hmm.
And I can't really speak of a lot of other places that were referred to as feud situations
Hmm.
from from the Mississippi River all the way to the Virginia line. But in Breathitt County's case, I think it has to do with that basic mantra of understanding Kentucky as a whole. And how does the rest of the states, particularly the powerful people in the bluegrass and in Louisville, react to this? They try to other it. They
Uh-huh.
try to say, well, we're Kentucky, that's Appalachia, that's the mountains.
Mhm.
And that's how we eventually get around to the assumption that the so-called feud phenomenon was something of the mountains rather than something that I would argue was more inherent to the very strange in between situation of Kentucky.
Mhm.
And that's what I was trying to bring about. But I think at the end of the day, I think I'm trying to convince people of what I might call a non-binary way of thinking about the North and the South.
Mhm.
And if you wanted to write a similar sort of book about Missouri, perhaps even Maryland and Delaware, I think you could. Those historians should try to make a case for that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's definitely been done for Missouri, but
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, real quickly, what are some how can people get the book?
well, I recommend that they order it directly from the University Press of Kentucky.
Mhm.
But if you're an Amazon zombie, then go ahead and get it. You can buy it from Amazon if you like. Uh, And I wish man, I wish I could name some individual bookstores that I knew had it. But honestly, there's one place I'm picturing in Frankfurt, the beautiful little bookstore right there across from the Capitol. They used
Mhm.
to have a copy of it on their shelves, um, but I definitely recommend ordering directly from the University Press of Kentucky, which you can find very easily by
Mhm.
Googling or using whichever search engine you choose.
We'll put the description or the link in the description, uh, to the University of Kentucky Press. It's pretty
Excellent.
easy, and shout out to them because they do, send us books and so forth about the new books and so forth, and if you get your book, if you can, get it from them or a
Yeah,
local bookstore.
yeah. They are my buddies, and anyone who's still trying to run a bookstore in 2024 is also my buddy, even if I don't know them. And I should also point out that the book is available as an audiobook.
Oh, that's awesome, yeah.
Yeah, and you can. I'm not sure how I feel about the voice of the dude that they chose to read it, but that's his job, so I can't complain. But it's also, if you're like me and you prefer just a book in your hand, it's available in both hardback and my personal favorite, paperback.
Yep, yep, yep. Real quick, plugs on your other books. Do you wanna mention any of them? Uh,
Sure. I can plug my history of the University of Tennessee called Bearing the Torch. Um, by the way, don't go looking for Bob Hutton. My nom de plume is TRC Hutton, and that's the case with both books. But
okay.
while I was at the University of Tennessee, I began a history of the university. I was sort of asked to, and I finished that after I left that university, and so that was my sort of my goodbye letter.
Does it
Um,
mention all the times Kentucky's beat Tennessee in basketball?
it unfortunately I put a lot of emphasis on women's basketball in the book.
Oh, gotcha. Well, alright, I understand.
Not unfortunately, not quite as much as on men's, although I probably should have. But it does. There's plenty of non-sports history in there too for anyone who is not only for Vols fans, but also for people who are just interested in the history of American education.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
learned a lot about that myself.
Yeah.
And I also currently working on a book on the mine guard system in West Virginia. So
Mhm.
I've kind of hopscotched from Kentucky, where I've done everything but live, to Tennessee, and now a book that's about Virginia and West Virginia and the mine wars of the early 20th century. And I'm just trying to check all the squares when it comes to Appalachian history as I
There
go.
you go. Yeah, well, that's some good there's some good history. One of my favorite, college classes was an Appalachian literature class, and we read a whole bunch of books, and some of my favorites still today, but, uh, needless to say, thanks a bunch for coming on and talking to us about, the book and, the things going on there in Breathitt County and some of the causes. as well. I encourage people to get the book out and go out there and get it. Of course, and any of your other books as well. Anything else before we go?
I also want to put in a plug for Glenville State University's Appalachian Studies program. It's
Mhm.
in the social science department along with our history poli-sci major. We are one of a very small number of schools that offers Appalachian Studies as an undergrad major. Most of the places where it's a curriculum, where it's part of the curriculum, it's as a master's degree
Mhm.
or perhaps some other form of concentration or what have you. But we do have it as a major, and we are a public university in West Virginia, and it's available to whoever is interested. So definitely want to plug that because
Mhm.
it's as much one of my babies as my books are.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Mm.
Well, thanks again for coming on. Again, if you don't want to come on and talk about some other books, we can do that as well. If you want to, write another Kentucky history book, we'll definitely talk about that. But thanks again for coming on, and we appreciate you taking your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.